Today we're going to introduce you to slow flight in the Sling 2.
We're going to go ahead and introduce flaps 1. And now we're configured for the maneuver. Here we are approaching 55, and now remember, sometimes you can be very nose high maintaining 55, and sometimes right now we're not even at 10 degrees and we're maintaining our 55 knots.
Hey guys, it's Matthew from Sling Pilot Academy. Welcome to our instructional maneuvers series, where we explain a maneuver on the ground, show you what it looks like in the plane, and go over some common mistakes. Enjoy the video.
Hello, my name is Declue, and welcome to the Sling Pilot Academy maneuver series. Today we're going to introduce you to slow flight in the Sling 2. Slow flight is one of the most fundamental maneuvers that you'll be doing for your private, commercial, and certified flight instructor check ride. During this maneuver, you are demonstrating that you understand how to control the airplane in a low energy state and change the aircraft's altitude and heading while maintaining a set airspeed. In order to demonstrate that you understand these aerodynamic relationships, we need to configure the aircraft for the maneuver. To start this maneuver, we're going to begin in straight and level on accelerated flight, typically at about 90 knots in the Sling 2. Now to enter slow flight, we need to start to bring our throttle back to reduce our airspeed so that we can be within our flap range. In the Sling 2, this is 85 knots. What we'll do is we'll bring the throttle back in small increments. Now what's very important as you bring the power back is that you maintain the starting altitude and heading that you began the maneuver in. So what we'll need to do as we bring the power back is add a little nose up trim to compensate for the lack of thrust. Once our airspeed is below 85 knots, we can introduce our first notch of flaps. What you'll need to pay attention to is every time you add flaps while beginning this maneuver, your aircraft is going to want to pitch down. So what we're going to do is add each flap incrementally and slowly. Once we add flaps 1, we'll increase our nose up trim to maintain altitude, restabilize the aircraft. As the airspeed continues to slow down, we'll add a second notch of flaps. Once again, this second notch of flaps will cause the aircraft to want to nose down. What we'll do once again is add some nose up trim to compensate. And now that we've restabilized, we'll add our second notch of flaps. Now once again, when we add that second notch of flaps, our nose will want to pitch down. What we'll need to do is add some nose up trim once again to compensate. Finally, we'll add our third and final notch of flaps. Once again, the nose will pitch down, we will add nose up trim to compensate. Once we have our flaps completely down and we're maintaining our altitude and our heading, we are now in slow flight. The next step is we need to set our airspeed. In the Sling 2, we do our slow flight at 55 knots. Now that we have our flaps down and a high amount of drag keeping the airplane slow, we want to maintain about 55 knots. The ACS says that we can do -0 and +10 on the airspeed. It's very important that while you're training, you try to maintain 55 knots as much as possible. Once we're in slow flight, the way that you control the plane will change to what you're normally compared to during, say, cruise. If your aircraft starts to descend, what you're going to do is actually increase your power. While in slow flight, we're going to be controlling our altitude with our throttle and our airspeed with our pitch. We'll demonstrate this relationship in the aircraft. As we continue flying in slow flight, we'll start to be assigned different turns, climbs, and descents. What's very important in slow flight is when you make any turn, you do it at a standard rate bank. In the case that you overbank and become too steep, your load factor may increase too much and cause the aircraft to stall. As you climb or descend, you will start with adjusting your power, then adjust your pitch to maintain 55 knots. We'll cover these exact aerodynamic relationships in the aircraft and demonstrate for you what it looks like. Now let's head out to the plane and go do it in the air.
Alright, so we're up in cruise right now, and the first thing that we're going to do before we start any maneuver is make sure that the aircraft is ready for the maneuver and that the area around us is clear. So to do that, we like to run the IP3C checklist, which is instruments, position, clear, call, and then configure. So we'll start out with the I, which is instruments, and we're just going to take a look at our panel here, make sure everything's green, everything's happy, we don't have any kind of warning lights or anything like that, which everything in this plane looks nice and perfect. Once we've done that, we want to determine our position. So we'll use our moving map and also visually to kind of gauge where we are and where we're going to go in the case that we have an emergency. So right now we're just south of Point Furman at 4,500, so we have some good altitudes where we can glide out 2.4 miles south, perfect. But now that we have our instruments and position checked, we're going to do our call and let them know what we're doing. PV practice area, White Sling 866 Sierra Lima, 2.5 miles south of Point Furman, 4,500 eastbound maneuvering, PV. Now that we made our call and the other aircraft know what we're doing, we're going to go ahead and make a 360-degree turn and visually scan for traffic around the entire turn to make sure that the area is clear. And we'll just do a nice visual scan, up, down, left, and right, and look for any aircraft that may pose a hazard to us during our maneuver. So we've completed our IP3C and we've cleared the immediate area for traffic, and now we're going to configure the aircraft for the maneuver. Now we're back at 4,500, we're on a heading of 180, and our airspeed is about VA of 91 knots. The first thing we want to do in slow flight is bring our airspeed back below VFE so that we can introduce flaps to help us slow down. And to do that, I'm going to slowly bring a little bit of power out, and as I do that, what's important is I maintain my altitude. Now you may pull back on the stick or just use a couple of buttons of trim and get the nose back up to maintain that altitude of 4,500. And as our airspeed slowly starts to come down and it bleeds below our white line there for our flap speed, we're going to go ahead and introduce flaps 1. Now that we have flaps 1 in, I can feel my nose is wanting to go down, so I can use a little bit of trim. I'm going to bring a little more power back and let our airspeed continue to bleed off. As it continues to drop, we'll go ahead and do flaps 2. I'm going to retrim for 4,500 and check my heading. Now that we're stable again, we'll go ahead and do flaps down to our full setting. Do a little more trim as our nose wants to go down. And now we're configured for the maneuver. Where the aircraft is happy, we have our fuel pumps on, our flaps are down, our lights are on, and we've cleared for traffic. Alright, so now that we're ready to start the maneuver, I'm going to start to bring the power back just a touch and pitch up. As I'm doing that, I'm looking for, again, 55 knots on the airspeed. Now, per the ACS, we can do -0 and +10, but it's very important that in the training environment, you try to hit 55 as constantly as you can. And now remember, we're doing pitch for altitude and power for airspeed. So if I start to climb, I'm going to pull my power back just a touch. If I start to get too fast, I'm going to pull my nose up just a touch. It's a little different than what sometimes you're used to in something like cruise. With this maneuver, what we're focusing on is the energy of the aircraft. So once you're in slow flight and you're maintaining your speed, you may start to get some turns, climbs, and ascents assigned to you by your instructor or your examiner. So in this case, I'm going to have Matthew give me a heading to turn to, and we'll turn to that heading.
Alright, turn to heading 270.
270. We're going to use our heading bug. Before we start the turn, we'll set our heading bug to 270. Now that we're there, we're going to do a constant rate turn. Very important that we make our banks very shallow in this state. If we bank too much, the load factor will increase too much and the aircraft may stall. So we'll go right to our green line here for our constant rate bank. For our continue looking, we're going to look at our altitude, which looks pretty good. Our airspeed's at 55, and we're approaching our heading. As we do that, we're looking outside for traffic. As we reach to our heading, we're going to slowly level the wings, and we're going to get the plane kind of re-stabilized. Now that the wind's coming at us in a different direction, we may have to retrim the plane to be happy in that state. So as we continue on this heading, we're going to make small adjustments with our power and our pitch to maintain 55 and maintain our altitude. Now, another part of this maneuver is going to be climbs and descents. So what I'll do before I start the descent is get my plane back in the proper state where I'm maintaining my current altitude and my 55 knots. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and give ourselves an altitude of, say, 4,000 feet that we're going to set for. So as we start our descent, what we're going to be using is the throttle to initiate our descent. So what I'll start to do is bring back the power. As I bring back the power, scanning outside, and I'm going to start looking at my airspeed. So we're using our airspeed for this descent. We're not really going to care about our altimeter until we get back towards 4,000 feet or our level off altitude. If I start to get a little too slow during the descent, all you do is just drop the nose just a touch. Just relieve a little bit of that back pressure, and you can see the speed comes right back up. Now, if I want to descend a little more, if I want to do, say, 500 feet per minute, I can continue to bring back the throttle, but almost idle. And if I continue pitching for about 55 knots, we can see that my descent rate has increased to about 500 feet per minute.
2.5 miles.
Now that our nose is down and we're descending, what's important to also note too is we may have to change our direction that we're adding rudder pressure in. Because we're using our power for altitude. We're going to slowly increase that power to maintain 4,000 feet. We're going to adjust our pitch to make sure that we maintain 55 knots, and we're checking our heading. Right now I have a nice little cloud straight ahead of me that I'm using as a visual reference to make sure I'm holding my heading. You can see I'm a little low, so I'm going to increase my power just a touch to get that back, and adjust my pitch to make sure I'm holding 55 knots on that climb back. Alright, so now that we're at 4,000 feet, we're holding our altitude and our heading, let's do a climb back up to 4,500. And once we get really advanced with it and we're comfortable, we can do climbs and ascents while turning. Like always, the first thing we'll do is we'll get our bug set for 4,500. Now that our altitude bug is set, We'll do a quick scan of our instruments so we can see everything's stable. We'll do a quick look outside and not see any traffic, and now we can initiate our climb. Just like with our descent, we're going to initiate the climb with our throttle. So what I'll start to do is increase the power. It doesn't have to be full, it just needs to start to increase. And I'm going to start to pitch the nose up just a touch to make sure I'm maintaining 55 knots on the airspeed. Now what's very important to watch out for this one is as we start to pitch our nose up and increase this power is our right rudder usage will need to increase just a touch. Now just like the descent, you can control how fast you climb based off how much power you input. So right now I'm not using too much throttle, and then that shows because I'm climbing at a very low rate. But if I want to climb a little faster, I can just increase my throttle a little more. As I do that, I'll have to pitch the nose up just a touch to continue maintaining my 55 knots. I'm going to have to add a little more right rudder, but now you can see we're getting near 500 feet per minute as we continue this climb up. And all that we're doing is making sure we do our visual scan outside for traffic, we're checking the horizon, kind of seeing we're looking at the relationship of our nose compared to the horizon, and then we're looking back inside, checking our airspeed, checking our altitude, checking our heading, and our rudder usage. As we start to approach our altitude, you can see it's coming up to 4,500. We can start to arrest our climb rate just a touch to make sure that we level off at the right altitude with the right airspeed. What's very important is that we don't leave the power in for too long, because if I start to lower my nose now, my airspeed's going to jump too much. So I want to bring my power back, but hold my nose up to try to maintain my airspeed as much as I can. I'm going to use my VSI to show if I'm climbing or descending. Now in this case, I'm still climbing just a touch, so what I'll do is just bring the power back just a little bit more, but I'm going to keep my nose pitched up because I'm trying to hold 55 knots. And now we've got ourselves in a good state where our VSI is showing we're just about level, our airspeed's pretty close to what we want, and our heading is on point. Now if I really want to get 55 perfectly, what I can do here is just pull the power back just a touch, and raise my nose up just a little bit. And we'll get ourselves back to 55 knots. Now let's go ahead and do a turning descent, and we'll talk about both. This is where it's very important that you have a solid instrument scan. So what we'll do is we're going to do a right turn to heading of 060, and we're going to descend back down to 4,000 feet. So now we're going to kind of combine the things that we just practiced. We're going to be doing a standard rate turn, and we're going to be descending at about 500 feet per minute while maintaining 55 knots. So we'll go ahead and initiate, and we'll do two things at once here. We'll bring our power back to initiate the descent, and we'll start our roll to the right. Go ahead and bring our power back. I'm going to start rolling to the right, and as I do this, I'm looking outside, and I'm also scanning my airspeed to make sure I'm pitching for 55 knots. If I get a little slow, I can lower the nose just a touch to get that airspeed back. And this is where your eyes really get moving, because you're looking outside for traffic as you're making a turn and you're descending, but you're also looking inside of your instruments to confirm that you're doing the correct bank angle and that your airspeed's not climbing too much, and that we roll out on our heading that's approaching soon. So there's our heading of 060. You can see I'm not really descending too much, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring the power back just a little bit. As I bring the power back, I'm going to use my pitch to maintain 55 knots. And I can bring back the power a little bit more. Let's get that descent rate really going down to 4,000. As I bring my power back, my nose instinctively drops, which actually helps because I'm trying to maintain 55 knots. So we're about 100 feet out. What we're going to start doing is adding a little bit of power to arrest that descent rate. They need to add a little bit of right rudder. We're watching our airspeed. We're doing a visual scan outside for traffic. Add a little more power. And now we're back to about 4,000 feet and 55 knots. What we'll do now is we'll do a left climbing turn. So first we'll set our heading bug for 360 and our altitude for 4,500. We'll go ahead and start that turn and start to increase our power. There's our standard rate. We'll look for traffic as we continue to increase the power, and we're going to adjust our pitch to maintain 55 knots. And we're just keeping our head on a swivel here. We're scanning for traffic, we're looking back inside, making sure that our bank's good. We don't want to overshoot our heading like I just did right there. This is why your head needs to be moving and scanning every instrument. We'll get back on our heading, use a little bit of rudder to help us out there, and we'll continue climbing back up. I can slowly introduce more power to get our climb rate going. I'm just going to continue using my pitch to try to maintain 55 knots throughout the climb. Use a little bit of trim to help me out there, relieve some of the pressure. And what's very important with this maneuver is that you see how slowly but thoughtfully we're moving the controls. We're not going full throttle right away. Because if I was to go full throttle when I went to start that climb, we would destabilize the aircraft and would mess up our maneuver, because then we'd start to fall behind. So like I said before, big changes in controls will cause the aircraft to destabilize, and it may cause you to mess up the maneuver. So you're in no rush to get to these points. As you saw, I took my time to get to 4,500. It's not a get there instantly kind of maneuver. It is a master control of the aircraft and energy of the aircraft to get yourself to that point while maintaining your assigned airspeed and heading.
Let's talk about exiting slow flight. One often overlooked factor of this maneuver is actually exiting the maneuver. Just like the entry, but opposite, to exit slow flight, we're going to start by increasing our throttle. As we do that, our nose will naturally want to start pitching up. As the nose starts to pitch up, we're going to use nose down trim to maintain altitude. As our airspeed starts to build back up, we can go from flaps down to flaps 2. And once again, when we switch to flaps 2, our nose will want to pitch up. It's very important that we try to maintain our starting altitude in the maneuver. So as your nose starts to pitch up, retrim to maintain altitude. If possible, try to pick a visual point outside that you can use to make sure that you're maintaining your proper heading. Now that we're at flaps 2, we're going to hold straight and level until our airspeed continues to build up to about 70 knots. As the airspeed reaches about 70 knots, we'll go from flaps 2 to flaps 1. Once again, our nose will start to pitch up, and we're going to use nose down trim to arrest that climb. From here, we're going to continue building our airspeed until we've reached 75 knots on the indicated airspeed. From there, we will go from flaps 1 to flaps up. Just like before, our nose will want to pitch up. We will arrest it with nose down trim. Now that the aircraft is back in straight and level flight, we're going to continue to accelerate until we reach our 90 to 91 knots on the indicated airspeed. We maintain our assigned heading and assigned altitude. Once the aircraft has reached unaccelerated straight and level flight, we have completed slow flight.
And then we're going to do what is arguably, in my opinion, one of the most important pieces of this maneuver, and it's actually exiting the maneuver. What's very important is that when we leave slow flight, we leave it in the way that we started, where we're doing very slow and meticulous flap changes, power changes, and trim changes to make sure that the aircraft maintains our altitude of 4,500 and maintains our heading of 270 as we try to get back to a straight and level flight with an airspeed of, say, 90 knots. So what we can start to do to clean up the aircraft is start to increase the power just a touch. We want to start getting our airspeed back towards the top half of the white band. As our power starts to increase, our nose is going to want to pitch up. So I'm going to add a little bit of nose down trim. As our airspeed starts to build, I can go flaps 2. Now that I've done flaps 2, I'm going to retrim. See how the nose jumps up? I can use a little nose down trim. I'm going to restabilize myself, because what I'm making sure I'm not going to do is I do not want to balloon and go above that 4,500. Our airspeed's still building. We'll go ahead and do flaps 1. I'm going to use a little more nose down trim. We'll do an outside scan. Airspeed still building. We'll go ahead and go flaps up. Use the last little bit of trim. And we can see that we're back at 4,500. We're maintaining that heading of 270. And our airspeed's building back up to about 91 knots, or our maneuvering airspeed.
Let's talk about some common errors that pilots often make when they first start slow flight. Just like steep turns, when you're performing slow flight for your private, commercial, or CFI check ride, it is a visual maneuver. Compared to slow flight, this maneuver does require a lot more of an instrument scan. While doing slow flight, your head will be on a constant swivel. You'll be scanning outside to check your nose compared to the horizon to see if your nose high or nose low. You'll also be scanning left and right for traffic or other conflicts that may arise. In between your outside scans, you'll be looking at your instrument panel and checking to make sure that the aircraft is where you want it to be. In a very short period of time, you need to scan your altitude, your airspeed, your heading, and your coordination to make sure that everything is where you want it to be. One thing that takes time for pilots to get used to while first learning slow flight is the relationship between looking outside and looking inside. In this maneuver, you may see that if you fixate on one of your flight instruments for just a second too long, the aircraft may become destabilized and you may fall outside of ACS standards. It's important that you continuously look outside and reference your nose pitch attitude compared to the horizon. When you do look inside, it's very important that you briefly glance at each one of your instruments and not stare at one for too long. Another common mistake that pilots will make when they first practice this maneuver is they over-control the aircraft. Changes in the aircraft control surfaces should be minimal. Once the aircraft is in equilibrium and your throttle is set where you want it to be, your altitude is holding and your airspeed is holding, you should not have to do many control changes at all. If you do make a control change, whether your airspeed starts to change, your altitude, or your heading, you need to make very meticulous and small changes in the controls. If you do over-control the plane, you may destabilize and fall outside of ACS standards.
Mastering this maneuver will help you master an approach to land because you'll know the energy of the aircraft and you'll know if you have too much power, if your pitch is too much on the approach.
And that's how you do slow flight in the Sling NGT. If you have any questions, reference the Sling Pilot Academy Sling 2 Maneuvers Guide or ask any CFI or a chief instructor. Thanks for watching.
Hey, people that wait till the fucking lights, they don't matter.
That's me.
Sorry, I hate you.
That's okay. I hate me too.
Oh my god.
I'm sorry. Yeah, it's okay.